can be actually explained what is better. But so that's all for now. Please, Scott, Susan, the floor is yours. Feel free to ask questions to the audience online, or also to the audience here in the media. And I don't know, Thomas, if you want to say a few words or you want to just listen.
I'm part of the audience today. I give all the MC challenge to you, Oscar, and I'm here to enjoy Scott and Susan lecture. Thank you again for joining us, and hello to everyone. Thank you.
If you haven't heard from us, he just say that he's going to sit down and enjoy the ride, and we hope he have work. He didn't say it in this way, but he's going to be sending us some questions. So please enjoy the presentation. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate asking and commenting, because the idea of the setup is also that it's a moment to ask all the things that you always wanted to ask someone about this field, but you couldn't. Today is the time for it. Good luck, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
How much time do we have? How much time do we have?
I don't know. It's set like an hour. It's 50. Yeah, the next workshop is at 1:30, right?
Okay.
So that would be the extremely
okay, super.
The hard deadline. But if you want to finish up at the time.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you, Tomas, and thank you, IAAC, for having us here. I'm going to try to navigate with my left hand the slides and the Zoom and talk to people in the room at the same time after just driving a manual transmission in the rain in Barcelona. So we'll see how skilled I am. It's a kind of lovely opportunity for us to have a chance to talk to those of you online, those of you who are here in person. And as Oscar said, you know, we're very informal, at least I think we are. This is an opportunity, I guess, for us to sort of share the work that we do and some of the ways we do that work, and also in particular the kinds of decisions that we make and why, because I think that's important, and those are some of the things that are often hidden. But it's also an opportunity for it to be a dialogue and to talk more about how we do this. We've kind of called this presentation How We Future. And I'll give you a little bit of background and we'll introduce ourselves as well. Okay, people in the waiting room, we'll see. Do I need to admit everyone in the waiting room?
Don't worry, we take care of it.
Cool. Someone else. One more task. All right, now the question is, can I actually get us going forward? Why?
You'll have to go out of the Zoom.
Hold on. We're stuck in the present for the moment. Hold on 2 seconds. Why is it not going forward?
I think you need to switch to the app that is you're in Zoom probably, so you need to switch to Keynotes or from whatever you are making the presentation.
That's really weird. Hold on.
There it is right there, so you can just click on that.
Yeah, that's what I'm in.
It's normally like the full screen, like desktop one, that's good.
Yeah, that's what I had in, but it's not.
Now we can see the screen changing.
Hang on. Okay. Okay, weird. All right, good. So we're back in the present. You never know what's going to happen. So I'm Scott Smith, and I'm the founder and managing partner of Changeist. We're a 13-year-old, almost 14-year-old. Is it okay? Here, do you want to reach in and try?
I don't know how it works. I don't know how to do it.
Oh, if you go.
Yeah. But what is the cursor?
Here.
Yeah, the cursor's disappeared for some reason.
When am I now?
Because you can collapse this if you can figure out how to get up there.
If I
That's
know
the problem
I
was having.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
You're not the only one.
Yeah, okay, now it's that.
I'm going to minimize this,
Okay.
try to share this.
Yeah,
Better?
yes.
Okay, so we can't see the people on screen anymore, but you can see us. So we were organized about 13, 14 years ago in the US to essentially help organizations, whether they're private companies or public organizations, government, education, cultural institutions, essentially to help organizations better understand, navigate, and take, or I guess sort of take advantage of opportunities and avoid risks in the future. Now that's a very vague description, and you'll understand more as we kind of go ahead. My background, originally I've been in forecasting of some kind for 25 years now. I started as a child, and but I worked in technology forecasting back in the 1990s on the early days of the internet, actually working with Telefonica back in the 90s on what the future might look like in terms of broadband and mobile and those sorts of things. And then I've been working more specifically in the futures field for, I think, 15, 16 years now. I've worked as a futurist at another organization and realized that the practice was actually heading in a new direction. And so I set up Changeist in 2007 in the US to take advantage of that and to try to explore new methodologies and new approaches that I think really are just starting to kind of come to maturity now in 2020. So maybe we were a good futurist. And I also write, and I've lectured for the past 10 years in the US at Duke University, brought that program here actually to IED in Gracia. Took that to Dubai with Susan to help create a thing called Dubai Future Academy to train the civil service and futures approaches there. And we do a lot of other things, but I'm only half of the story.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Cox-Smith, and I am a partner and executive producer at Changeist. My background is actually in design. So this atmosphere is very, very familiar to me and feels very comfortable. So I'm really excited to be here. We don't always work with design students, but we really enjoy working with design students because we feel like what we do and what we teach can be very, very beneficial for helping to interrogate, is this what, is this the future we want? Is this the future that, works for most people? And that's kind of something that we want to talk to you about today, about making those decisions as you go through your practice.
Probably a good time to ask before we go much further, how many of you have done prior work on kind of future forecasting, scenarios, trends, future focused design? 1, 2.
Maybe submit a copy newsletter.
Okay. Well, that's not unusual. I think this is kind of the moment that we're at, that this is actually a kind of new area and a new sort of turn for the discipline or disciplines involved in design, as well as a lot of other areas. Because I come from a more traditional strategy background, but with a kind of design interest. And Susan, coming from a design background, as a company, we have a kind of mixture of both, I guess, both sides of the brain in a way. We have someone who's a science fiction novelist, but also has a master's degree in foresight and innovation. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. We have another designer who works with us who comes from a background in play and experience, but that's also something that we can apply here and take her knowledge and expertise and blend that in. So we sort of look at our practice as very much a fusion of a lot of different disciplines and backgrounds, and also understanding that there's not a big pipeline of people, sort of futurists that are produced every year in the world. They sort of become, they sort of emerge from the mist in different disciplines, partly out of curiosity and interest and focus, and now a bit more because of this is the earliest kind of feeling for commercial demand and a way of actually articulating what this means. So we are a partnership, and we have a group of about, I guess, 4 or 5 professionals that work with us on an ongoing basis, depending on what projects we do. And the reason why is because, let's see if we can change slides again. No,
You're back in Zoom.
we're back in Zoom instead of back on the slides. See if you can fight your way out of it, because you're better at this than the types of organizations we work with are incredibly diverse. We haven't, when we first started out, we worked more with what you would probably call consumer brands, particularly in the US, because the demand for our area was much more around innovation, you know, kind of consumer-facing companies looking to understand what the future might hold so they could develop the next generation of product. And while that's one place that you can actually apply this work, it's not necessarily the most interesting. It is a kind of a dimension in terms of organizing trends, etc. Hang on, let's see if we can just escape out.
Nope.
We may just leave our bios up forever. The types of organizations that we've worked with really since we moved to the Netherlands in 2015, in part to actually kind of get away from the innovation stream that we were sort of focused in, because we didn't necessarily think the best way to be practicing the kind of activities that we do was simply to help companies produce another thing. You know, whether that was another, you know, shoe or pasta sauce or soda or car or healthcare product, whatever. And those are all real cases. And so there's a kind of, I guess, a lot of different directions that you can kind of point this activity. So in the past 5 years, we've worked a lot more with public-facing organizations, in part to help governments who are trying to adapt themselves to the sort of futures arena and understand how best to develop policy that can help us get to the futures that we're interested in. I wonder if we pull the USB out and kind of free it from the projector for a minute.
Yeah.
You can share the presentation.
Yeah, there's a problem with the.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we're just there, is that, no, that's still in the Zoom. There we go.
So
The problem, yeah, we're not projecting is the problem.
Okay.
there's a problem with the thing, but
We need to be in the, like, have PowerPoint, the keynote up front.
Okay.
Okay, so
Oh, now it's going back into.
okay.
If we touch,
Don't touch
nothing,
anything.
okay.
Don't touch anything.
Everyone back away from the future right now. We're used to this because in the past 6 months, our lives are about as weird as your lives are. But this, if you can see up on screen, the different kind of organizations, some of you recognize, you know, if you buy clothes online, you may recognize ASOS. If you buy insurance, you may recognize AXA, BBC, UNICEF. Each of these is a very, very different question or sort of issue or way that they want to understand the future, and actually probably the minority of that starts out being something material, which is important from your perspective, because if you're sort of looking at speculation through design, that's not something that these organizations have caught up with yet. But interestingly, they are more and more curious about it as the word starts to spread. Really, in the past few years, the idea of fusing design and sort of producing objects and experiences and things that people can touch and engage with physically has generated a lot more interest. So, for example, with some of the government departments that you see up there, especially in the UK, because the RCA is there, there's kind of a slightly longer tradition of doing future-focused design. They're starting to actually ask for these things by name and come to us and say, we think we'd like to do some kind of material artifact development, some kind of experience to help us understand government policy better in the near future. That's an unusual request, but it's becoming more common. So what we're going to do later on is go through some different projects that we've worked on that kind of show you some different layers of how we do that work. But you can see everything from on the far left side, you've actually got on the top a defense organization that is trying to prepare military and security for the kind of threats of the future. And most of those are things like climate change, migration, pandemics, the sorts of things that also UNICEF is dealing with, or the Red Cross is dealing with, or these sort of departments of science and industry and different governments are trying to understand how they feed innovation to deal with these problems. Some others are things like Aldar, the sort of square up there on the left-hand side, is one of the biggest property companies in the UAE. They own a lot of residential housing, shopping malls, develop entire kind of districts in the city. So they're very interested in everything from the future of cities to the future of mobility to healthcare, real estate, big data. They're starting to understand how you can use enormous bodies of data and satellite information to map future cities and understand the climate. So each of these organizations is actually kind of asking something that reaches into many of the other ones. So there's actually kind of a commonality to all of these in that they're all confronting very big problems and very big challenges that are multifaceted, multidimensional, and extremely difficult to untangle. And that's not something that traditional strategy can really assess and approach. And so they're looking for very different ways to try to gain insight into what the kind of key issues of the future might be. So whether they're kind of big trends, beautiful, thank you. Whether they're sort of really big trends or emerging issues, how those differ around the world. So it might be one set of issues here in Europe, there might be other issues entirely in North America, Asia. There are global issues, and so we'll talk a little bit more about some of that. So all of this is to kind of say, we kind of approach this as, I would like to think, very clever generalists. We have a really wide kind of base of knowledge spread across our team, both in terms of issues in the world and all the kinds of trends that we deal with, but also different kind of vertical areas of expertise and interest. Things that I'm interested in, versus some of the projects that Susan works on. And we tend to kind of interchange. So we're much more like, I guess, a band that picks up different instruments, but we're playing, generally the same music over time. Do you have anything to add about that? Let's see if we can get to the next slide. Part of the reason why we're here is because, yes. Okay, we can escape out.
Okay.
Super. Okay, thank you, Tomas. One of the things that we realized, and part of this has come through teaching over the past 10 years, is there aren't many places to go to kind of tap this sort of knowledge. I didn't come from an academic background in this field, but I worked directly with some of the kind of second and third generation really important sort of people who formed and founded a lot of the methodologies and tools, but coming from from the outside to sort of learn to adapt and modify these tools in different ways to try to gain deeper insight for us and the client in all of that wide spectrum of issues that I just talked about. So starting about a year ago, we sat down and wrote the textbook, or the sort of guidebook that had been missing for us. Because in teaching for 10 years, I never had a textbook to go from. But we also have been teaching in North America, here in Europe, to people who are coming from everywhere from Brazil and Argentina and Ecuador to Poland, Russia, Turkey, etc. Then moving into the Gulf and teaching across Islamic cultures for 3 or 4 years, working in Southeast Asia, India. It gave us a kind of way to test what we thought we knew, and also ways to better get that information across to people from very, very different backgrounds and levels of knowledge. So we set about writing this book that basically is we talk about it as a practical, tactical handbook or guidebook to applied futuring. In other words, what does it look like when you do this in the real world? And what are the kind of decisions that you make? What are the challenges that you face on everything from research to building teams for different projects because you don't need the same team for every project, to dealing with different forms of information, to finding different ways to reveal that information and engage the people who pay us and their audiences or their stakeholders or their citizens in all of this. So we've got this book developed up to the end of last year. It was supposed to come out this summer. COVID slowed that down, but we just published it last week through, we have a British publisher in London who has put the book out, but it hasn't actually reached Spain yet. So we have the only box in the country behind us. We'll talk about that later. But it was an opportunity to try to document a lot of this and share it. So I was the main author. My colleague Madeline Ashby, who's the science fiction writer, helped me co-write it and kind of give voice to a lot of what we've seen in workshops and engagements. And then Susan very courageously dove into all of that material and turned it into something that humans can read. And so we have a book. So part of the sort of trick of doing this is getting a kind of common basis in, in the same way that we might have to kind of negotiate which language we're going to want to do this presentation in, or what OS are we all going to run this operating, our software on. We have to kind of find some common frameworks to get everyone at least in the same space to think about the future as a general area. And I did a talk at SonarD on Saturday where I kind of critiqued this approach a little bit, but I still find it somewhat useful, at least as a kind of starting point. And that is, you may have seen some variation of this diagram before, but what you see on screen is what's broadly known as the futures cone. It actually came out of the military in the 1980s and 90s, and then was adapted by a couple of design academics, one named Joseph Oros, who taught in Australia in a foresight program there. But what it basically is trying to kind of get across is the idea that if you think about the future as a kind of mental space or a territory, it's effectively this kind of terrain that our knowledge about what's out there ahead of us is very much like kind of looking at our kind of car headlights at night, in the fog. We see more clearly directly in front of us. We have better sort of visibility about what may be happening, what's certain, what's kind of critical, what's repetitive, or what's scheduled. All of those things are kind of sitting in the very near space out in front of us conceptually. But the further out in time you go, the more vague those things become. We could talk about this just for days as a kind of philosophical idea, but it's a way of at least kind of giving us a sense of where we might start to kind of place what we find and what we know about the future. We're kind of constructionist, I think, in our way of thinking about it, and this will start to make sense of it more as you go. But if you are kind of here on the left, that white blob, and you're sort of looking out into the future, and that might be 5 years or 10 years or 50 years or 100 years, depending on the question, there are those issues that you think are probable based on what you know about the world right now. Things like this week's weather, or you're going to come back to class tomorrow or sometime this week. You have these kind of plans laid in place. You have calendars and schedules, etc. We know there are things like elections that happen on certain cycles in theory. All of those things that are kind of predictable, quote unquote, are sitting in front of us. Then just out to the side of that are things that are plausible. Based on what we know about the world right now, they might happen, they might not, we don't know. It's supposed to clear up in the weather this afternoon, but let's see. It's plausible that it might rain again tomorrow, but we're not 100% sure. We might have a new leader in the US next year. Right now, we're still stuck in plausibility land, maybe impossibility land. So all of those are kind of like maybe yes, maybe no type questions. And the further out in time you go, the more things kind of fit in that land. And then on the outside of that, there's what we sort of consider the physically possible. What are the things that aren't impossible? they're theoretical. There might be, we've just discovered there might be life in the atmosphere of Venus. That was news that emerged last week. We've known about things like quantum computing as a theoretical possibility for decades, but whether it was going to happen and when is it going to be realized and when is it actually here, we don't quite know. So all of that's to say we sort of find this as a way of sketching the terrain and starting to think about what's out there. And I've kind of been this big circle called possibility or opportunity space, because out there is where we've actually got enough kind of freedom and creativity and ambiguity and uncertainty to play and start to combine possibilities and probabilities and plausibilities and different combinations that give us a little bit of a sandbox for creativity. So when we do our work, sometimes we're dealing with issues that may be happening in the next 6 months. Sometimes we're dealing with issues that may take 100 years. If you take, for example, sorry? Yeah, so terraforming Mars is something that, since we've been talking about it, I was actually just going to say, some JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, are some friends of ours, and we talked to them about long-range futures, because when you build a satellite or you build a space probe, or you start planning and budgeting the engineering for terraforming Mars, you have to be thinking on a very long time horizon. Terraforming Mars could take 100 years, which if you're doing it right, you're not just worried about the biology and the engineering, you're also worried about the sociology of who's going to go there and how their lives are going to be and what things they're going to need in their farm bubble while they try to generate oxygen on Mars. So some things we deal with are very big and abstract like that. And some things are what's going to happen after lockdown ends. We've spent the past 6 months answering a lot of questions about post-pandemic, and when is it? Do we know what that looks like? So to your point about terraforming Mars, we can think about all of those long-range technologies or big ideas that we have, or building robotics or self-driving cars or creating new genetic materials or new drugs or all of these sort of things. You can plan those as abstractions or government policies that will fund those, or how to train people for those jobs, but everything else is still happening in the middle. Those things don't happen by themselves in a vacuum alone. And this is a trick, you have a sort of a critical thing to keep in mind in this sort of design field, as it is in engineering and technology, is that we tend to try to collapse this cone into a really tight space, and we focus very much on the thing that we're here to do. And yet the rest of the world is still happening. Pandemics are still happening. Genetic change is happening, and biology is happening. Demography is happening. Populations are changing in different countries. Generations have different interests and needs from a consumer point of view, from a human point of view. Different people are in power. The economy can change over time. Climate change, fires, viruses, floods, all of these things are still happening while we're thinking about this kind of shiny future that we've planned out there. So our job is effectively to start mapping all of those things together, depending on what the question is, and find a way to reach this orange line, if you can sort of see it, as we think about that as our preferred future. Depending on who you are, who we're working with, who you're working for, that preferred future might be very different. The city of Barcelona may want a preferred future that eliminates all petroleum vehicles, creates a closed cycle of waste, provides education for everyone, enables gender equity, all these sorts of things. Somebody else may have a very different preferred future, a financial preferred future or a social preferred future. So in each of these, each time we engage with a client or I try not to even think about them that way, but people who bring us questions, we kind of replot this map and find different ways to help them understand what they need to understand. because not every endpoint is the same. And we'll kind of talk about some of those different modes of work in a second. I'm barreling down the future road, so Susan, if you have anything to add, jump. Any questions so far? Or?
We have a concrete example of a question.
Sorry, I have a question from the audience.
And what would be a concrete example of one of the questions brought to you and what sort of what the path looks like?
I can answer that more comprehensively with some examples in a couple of steps, but I'm trying to sort of think of the types of questions that we deal with. They might be issues like, and so here's some actually concrete ones that we've played with in the past year or two. What does the future of insurance look like when it's no longer structured the way that it is now? In other words, how do we think about risk in the long term? Right now, insurance is based on abstract probabilities that something might happen, and you pay a certain amount of money each month. The insurance company sets it aside, invests it in the market, and then they use that to pay you when you have an accident or an injury or something like that. Because of things like big data, climate change, population change, all of the variables involved in how insurance is run for the past 400 years are changing. So you need to not only know what risks are you insuring for, but how do you deal with a world where you might actually have much better anticipation of when and where that's going to happen. That I might be able to, in 5 years' time, price the long-term risk of you getting injured in a flood or forest fire somewhere in the world based on all of your lifetime's behaviors.
Yeah. I'm from Pasadena, La Cañada, so the fire insurance hasn't changed, but yet every year we have at least 1 big fires. But
right.
The insurance model hasn't changed, so therefore you're paying the same premium you did 10 years ago in those areas. Yeah,
so there's a question. We had another one in our courses that we've taught in Dubai where we may be working with customs and immigration. And they're thinking about a world pre-pandemic. They were asking these questions, sort of what's going to happen when we have things like Hyperloop or hypersonic travel, and the clock speeds up because customs and immigration deals on a certain rhythm, right? Of trains and planes and boats arriving and people coming and going. But when travel becomes faster because of new technologies, suddenly the pace accelerates wildly for them, and so they have to start anticipating emerging risks much earlier. Things like when you have a commercial space flight and you're running the customs bureau, how do you deal with people coming from another across the world landing in 2 hours with some exotic vegetables in their carry-on? This is not an unusual question. It sounds crazy, but we're within the window of planning for that type of question.
Or what is the customs procedure for products that come from space? If you're mining on an asteroid and you need to bring those things down somewhere, what's the process for cataloging and, estimating the value of blah, blah, blah. Right, yeah. It's not, contaminated or the Andromeda strain or something like that. So, these are the kind of questions that get brought to us that we have to think about very much in almost like a very practical way. It's not always tell us about the most fascinating, technology that we want to, invent, or what should that look like. It's, what are the practicalities of bringing this idea into the world?
Now back to the escape issue. For some reason, the slide stopped working again. So yeah, it runs an incredibly wide spectrum. And we've given a couple of sort of sci-fi examples because some of them are like that. In other cases, some of the things we'll show you have to deal with, we actually work quite a lot around humanitarian issues. We feel quite strongly that technology shouldn't suck up all of the future resources, that we have much bigger issues to deal with in the world, like energy transition, new food, capabilities for production, you know, things like waste in the world, all of those kinds of issues. We deal with things like, you know, thinking about kind of the future of migration.
It was common.
See, control, command tab, yeah.
That basically, right?
Yep.
And now we now
We're trapped in a slide we didn't create.
control tab. And there's no
It's strange that it's doing
command.
this. Let's see if I can break out here again.
No, I think that when you were in the other one, now of course I think where I am. How
I
did you
just
do
do is
the-
like share my desktop and here. Yeah, let's do this. Let me get rid of format. And let's just do this the old-fashioned way. Can you still see that on the screen? And Zoom, I think, can see it.
You can put it in full screen, like in
Yeah.
not full screen for
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we're gonna do this way. So, yep. We're gonna break Zoom and innovate. No. It's, I mean, we've just learned to kind of, again, risk, like we've learned to absorb. So it's a super wide range of questions, but they tend to be big in scope. The time horizons differ very much based on what's the organization, what is their natural time horizon. And by time horizon, I mean, you know, JPL in Pasadena might be dealing with, again, needing to think about space probes that have a 100-year lifespan. Or if we're looking at questions of the future of the ocean and climate change for the UK government, we need to think about it on a long enough time horizon that the climate can actually change. Asking that question with a 5-year endpoint doesn't really do much good because not a lot is going to change enough. But if we talk about in 25, 30, 50-year time increments, then we can see a big system view. Or it might be a consumer product that is innovating very quickly, like a project I'll show you a little bit about later in video technology. And how do we change our behavior in video consumption changes like weekly right now. You know, you jump from like watching things in YouTube to Netflix to TikTok to, you know, whatever else is going to be out next week. Suddenly, poof, TikTok is gone, you know. So our behavior patterns and our consumption is sort of rapidly turning over in those sorts of sectors, whereas the technology is kind of shifting on a 24, 36-month basis. So the dynamics can be very, very different. The other question is, not every organization is trying to do the same thing or answer the same question. Some are, and we kind of developed this set of like steps here, but some are just trying to kind of anticipate what's coming. What are some of the emerging trends that are happening out there right now? So we can think about how that might affect us financially or politically or whatever those sort of issues are. So, you know, will we continue to have more customers in the future for this thing that we're making? Will people keep buying X? Will people be flying in 5 years' time? So they're just kind of taking a line and drawing it out. The next are trying to get a little bit more interesting and say, if there's a pandemic and people stop flying, then what does the future look like? So you're sort of taking two ingredients, putting them in the pot together, and they're trying to envision a future that may be a little bit different. The third one is like, well, let's actually be a little bit more bold here and ask, what happens if we disappear? What happens if we're no longer in business, or our field becomes illegal tomorrow, or a new disruptive product is introduced that changes people's behavior, you know, quickly. We have questions like this around, for example, pharmaceutical company might come to us and say, we need to understand the future of relaxation and wellness. And they may be thinking about the products they provide now and what everybody's buying right now. But over here in the land of politics and culture, that country might be legalizing cannabis. And so suddenly this whole, you know, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry gets kind of knocked sideways by something that was illegal until last month, wherever you are. So you're thinking about all of these kind of,
Like the CBD and the.
yeah.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's something that wasn't, for example, in the US wasn't. Sorry. Your colleague was just asking, you know, were we talking about things like CBD? CBD. See, I haven't had enough. Yeah, those kinds of things that were off the radar in a commercial sense before because it may not have been legal, and that's not what a company is really focused on. And then tomorrow, this new thing emerges.
And as a real world example, that was something that we actually brought to a wellness company. And because it was still illegal, they were not legally able to explore what their options might be. And so they realized that if things were made legal, that they were still going to have to wait to search for that opportunity space for their organization, even though they might have been able to anticipate that it's coming. So those are the kinds of questions that we want to be able to put on the table for organizations to consider. You know, what would be your plan if? And that's that discovery phase.
And then you have like a multinational in the US, which can sell in California, but can't sell in Florida.
Right. So someone's providing the example of, you know, the U.S. The state laws differ, so the opportunity is not evenly distributed. It's sort of happening in different places. So, you know, on the one hand, we're talking about, you know, next generation travel and transport. Over here, we're talking about lifestyle and you know, relaxation and pharmaceuticals. Over here, we're talking about urban design and planning. And somewhere else, we may be talking about, you know, religion and spirituality. Those things actually connect over time when you start to sort of draw the map bigger and think about what that looks like. And I guess the last thing I want to sort of say on this slide is this thing of, you know, the one on the far right, this kind of idea of shaping a more kind of, I guess you could call it forward-leaning provocation, where you're actually trying to create and invent markets or change the sort of dynamics of whether it's a commercial market or change the law that creates new opportunities somewhere. You know, this is the sort of land of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, where you are effectively making markets out of creating new things. A lot of people think that's the really kind of interesting, cool place to play, but it's also the incredibly high risk place to play, where you're actually inventing realities for other people to follow. And pushing further than the law can manage. So this is where you get this kind of, on the one hand, like, wow, disruptive breakthrough innovation, but also, wow, you might have just broken the legal system of several countries and disrupted the lives of people you didn't mean to step on. So this is the land of move fast and break things that doesn't always work the way you want it to. But that's all the way at the other end of the spectrum from very cautious kind of risk monitoring and looking for those sort of situations. Oh, I can do it this way. Let's see. Here. So just briefly, across all of these different types of questions that we tackle, we tend to go through these similar phases. The first kind of element that we get into is first kind of scoping the question, really trying to understand what is it in fact organization needs to know. What are they going to do with it? Is this for a new product? Is this for exploration? Is this for education? Is this for raising awareness in different populations? Those are all very different endpoints to exploring the future. Then we're able to understand what the sort of outlines of the question is and what those sort of adjacent areas are that we need to do research in. And that's where we actually start what we call sensing, which is effectively grounded research, where we are going out and looking to understand what trends are relevant to this issue on these timelines, what experts think may be happening, what new innovations may be emerging in different areas that could have an impact on a long enough timeline. This is kind of where we take in knowledge and insights to start mapping them. Then we go through a process of looking at all of that information and trying to sort of understand patterns and pathways. If these different trends are kind of happening at different speeds and different times, when we lay them all out on a map of, let's say, time from, you know, the present to 10 years, what does it look like when we put them together as a bigger picture? And you start to see, oh, this innovation over here, this social change over here, and this long-term shift in the law over here actually come together to make something interesting. So once you start populating that terrain with, over time, uncertainty with trends, back to the sort of cone I showed you, then you begin to kind of get a very low resolution picture of what the future might look like for the sake of exploration. You start to draw the features on the map, on the landscape of that time period, if that makes sense. From there, we're able to then kind of dive into that map and say, let's explore this particular piece and draw out of it a scenario or a sort of story of what happens when the innovation, the social change, and the law happen around the same time. What does that look like in the world? How will we describe that moment in the future? Who lives there? What's there and what's not there? What's needed and what's not needed? And then we start kind of looking at it almost as a sort of future use case question, where you have you know, personas, kind of environmental dynamics, needs, wants. So we're kind of zeroing in on the ability to then think about how we tell that story, how we might prototype something that exists in that world, to use that as a way to help our clients kind of explore more deeply. And to be able to sort of tell stories about it, because one of the most important things is not keeping it to ourselves, but allowing it to sort of move through the organization that we're working with. How does our client tell their story of the future to someone else? So we have to be thinking kind of through the problem to the communication element beyond, and understand what's the best way to engage that public. And then at the end, we step back, and every time we ask, was this the right way to do it? Did we have the right tools, the right information, the right people? You know, was this experiment successful or unsuccessful, and how would we do it differently next time? So now we're going to move out of theory and move into a little bit of practice. Taking some of these slices, the first one being that kind of sensing and sense-making piece, how do we actually identify and socialize different futures to the organizations we're working with and to the audiences they're working with? And the first example is actually something that's just fresh out of the oven, but it's a really good example of something you probably wouldn't think about, but is incredibly necessary right now. Susan ran this project, so we'll kind of give you a quick fly through of that.
I was approached by the International Women's Development Agency out of Melbourne about 3 months ago. It was not long ago. We turned this around very, very quickly. And they wanted a sort of convening or workshop that they could run independently with their own facilitators to help consider feminist futures in a post-COVID 2030. It was a really, really exciting opportunity for me, and I built a team of myself and 5 other women, all of whom either work in futures or strategy, and my colleague Lily, who is the does a lot of the design work and has a lot of deep background in play and immersive games. So together we came up with 36 trends that we felt were globally relevant. Most of the groups that would be running these convenings would be in the global south. So we took that into consideration, but we did want it to be a broad enough set of trends that anyone who read them would be able to have some understanding of what was being described. So we then had the IWDA group rank those 36, and we dropped down to 24, which is what we used.
Trends. Trends.
Oh, trends, sorry. That we used as sort of the scaffolding and the ground content from which these groups would be able to work together. Our biggest challenge was I understand futures and I understand the tools, but we had to create something that could be used by non-expert audiences to give some sense of the tools that we use to discover possible futures. And at this level, it's very much that sort of sensing and sense making aspect that we wanted them to look at. So what we came up with was a 3-hour convening that could be run over Zoom and Miro. This is an image of the Miro space and
some of the Miro.
Some of the Miro space, but basically what we had was 24 trends, some of the foundational principles of feminism, as well as 10 or 12 privileging forces that are always impactful on the trends that we were presenting to them. And from those trends, we would have them break into groups and use a tool that we call a futures wheel, or an impact wheel, or an implications wheel. There are several different names for it. But it gives people an opportunity to closely examine one particular trend and then use sort of this wheel process of saying, well, if this happens, what might happen next? And this is where all the possible futures can be brought out. So the impacts that come out at second, third, fourth level might be completely contradictory, but you start to build threads of, if this thing happens, well, what happens next? And thinking from a feminist lens, you know, say one of the ones that we did as just an example for them was backlash against women. So if, you know, there was an increase in, you know, political moves that took away women's right to vote, how would a feminist respond to that? It's a bad thing. You don't want that to happen, but are there things that could be done, you know, either socially or, you know, politically or legislatively that might be able to turn that thread into, from a negative into a positive. So what we were trying to do is to allow these feminist convenings to have constructive conversations about where the opportunity spaces might be, even in situations that were inherently negative from a feminist perspective. So yeah, we turned that around in about 3.5 weeks, and it's just launched, and apparently there's been a great deal of interest in running these really around the world.
And I think the thing that's interesting about this example and why we've kind of put it in here, this is not a physical object or item, but it's a kind of a digital information space, a knowledge space that was created for people who have no background in our field, but who need to be thinking several steps ahead in terms of creating policy and programs that can anticipate some of these changes happening. And as that shift begins to happen, they can have the policies in place or the programs in place to be helping the people that they serve. So these are women's groups who are operating, as Susan said, around the sort of basically Southern Hemisphere, often very little funding, very little technical expertise, but don't have the ability to anticipate how different factors might come together. But with these kinds of tools, they're able to think about how they might intervene in the political process well in advance to both kind of raise awareness about some of the trends that could be happening in the future, but also create anticipatory programs and legislation. But it's also an example of having to take our physical work and turn it into something digital very, very quickly to be able to kind of keep operating and keep working with these groups over time. Now, another thing that might look like is this is actually, for us, similar thing, totally different representation. Both of these kinds of examples are where we're actually doing ongoing research, collecting our own knowledge, building databases or sort of inventories of trends in different sectors that we deal with. Space is one that we have an interest in because we've worked with a couple of different space agencies. Because it is one of those kind of fun and interesting long-term issues. But we also need to reach audiences who aren't, again, familiar with our tools and methods, like spacecraft engineers or biologists, exobiologists, astronomers, people who are working in highly technical fields, but don't they're thinking about how to deal with their engineering challenge and not necessarily thinking about what's the social context that's happening around that. So we created, whereas the last example was a digital set of trends that groups could interact with online, these were simply physical sets of trends that groups could draw at random different combinations and sit down and basically sketch concepts and ideas. Yes?
What was on the image?
Well, the previous image? So we try to kind of speak the vernacular of our clients. And in this case, these cards were packaged up in the same way. So the question is, what was on this image? These cards are packaged in the same way that like food and medication and supplies get packaged to take it up to the ISS in different missions. So we knew that that was kind of meeting them where they live. It would be familiar in their working environment. We went through different, doing sort of image research to find what the packaging looks like, got the Mylar, created this sort of barcoding in the same way so that when we passed these out inside these engineering teams, they would have something that it was our way of saying, we get you. And they like it because that gives them something that they can step away from their, their engineering endeavors and get together socially and start to ask questions about, what does it mean to think about space heritage? How do we protect things like lunar landing zones from the 1960s and 70s? How do we, if we decommission a space station, how do we protect that? What do we do with archiving satellite data? What is the kind of heritage responsibility to your children of bringing things back from space? What does an activist look like in the space arena? People who, we're seeing this issue right now where international organizations are negotiating the next round of treaties that tell us, who owns what. If we, put people on the moon or on Mars or on Venus or wherever, or mine asteroids, we're just now beginning to work out what the law looks like for that. So what does an activist look like for a space legal issue? Probably some people who are here on Earth right now, but we need to be thinking ahead of kind of how those things work. How do we live when we're away from our families for a decade? What can we learn from the past and how is that going to change in the future? So these were just ways to get them to think creatively about some of these problems. And those types of tools we often make and kind of distribute to the groups we're working with to help them kind of get into our world. And it's a kind of common meeting space where we can be a bit more playful about thinking about the future. Now, stepping up a level from that, we're often mapping that information together more formally to answer very specific questions. The next example I'll show you is actually from Comcast, which is one of the biggest media companies in North America. I think they also own Sky in the UK now. And so it's an enormous media empire that also has some of the most advanced video technology available. But if, again, kind of like other areas, if you get too focused on the technology or the business model, you start to lose sight of the way the world might be changing and what our consumption habits look like and how the company might deal with very, very different futures. And one thing I can tell you is engineers love stepping back out of their day-to-day work and being able to look at those bigger kind of contexts. So we spent about 3 months researching the future of media across different platforms and devices and channels, looking at changing consumer behavior, changing generational activities and behavior, created a map of, it's hard to really see anything here, but this is kind of our working inventory of about 70 trends that we had mapped out over the next decade for, that would kind of give us a picture of the future of video, entertainment, and information.
This is our research phase, and this is where we bring together all the information. So, and we pretty much do this for every large scale project that we do. So what you see here is we would have done something exactly like that for the space cards, but we just translate them into a format that is easily digestible and usable by the client. So what you're seeing are all the different examples of how we can produce a sort of useful material for these clients to play with or to consider.
So if you think about this as kind of where we capture our raw research, we're then taking it up a level. This is not even the full snapshot, but it's kind of a rendering of where we mapped these things over time, the present being on the left and the sort of 2030, you know, a decade out on the right. This became our kind of notional map of different directions that media might evolve in, and they aren't mutually exclusive. These are sort of things that could be happening across the same time horizon, but in different directions. And then we begin to ask ourselves, well, if this kind of thread of trends evolves over the next decade, and we've given them these kind of short names for us to remember, what kind of future evolves out of that? And then we start to sort of see the stories come into focus for us, and we're able to communicate what the world looks like in a decade's time when these different trends kind of evolve together. So, and often the trick here is kind of coming up with fun, memorable names. We actually, because we were working with a video engineering team, we sort of gave them a Netflix-like presentation of the material, because that's what they do all day. They build systems like Hulu and Netflix and Roku and all those sort of things. So we created these future stories to almost look like choosing, you know, panels off of a Netflix show. So that was kind of meeting them where their head is in their daily work. Commissioned an illustrator to take our stories and start to kind of render some visuals out of them. In this case, we were actually talking about in a near future where climate change gets worse, social isolation is increasing, but also the fidelity and richness of media that you can deliver inside the home is greater. People will start to kind of collapse into, you know, home-based bubbles of consumption. This is pre-pandemic by 2 years. So things like virtual reality, augmented reality, larger, flatter screen TVs that sort of become part of the furniture, you know, stories that are more personalized because of different recommendation algorithms. So taking just that one development thread and kind of stretching it out, you know, you describe something that actually doesn't sound that great when you when you really consider it, but it has certain implications for the company delivering all of that. One of which is they're no longer just in the program business of like buying interesting movies and TV shows and piping them into a home. They're increasingly responsible for all the infrastructure, the housing even, and becoming kind of the owners of real estate that they're, so it's not just running a cable to a building and leaving it. If you're delivering all of these other services, maybe education, maybe healthcare, wellness, yoga, basically everything we're experiencing now when we're staying home and, you know, riding Peloton and doing school from home and work from home. This was well pandemic, but it's the world we're living in kind of right now. And you can't really see, but there's smoke outside our window. But the way that we kind of dealt with that was to not just tell that story in a flat sense, and it's really hard for you to see what's here, but this was basically the kind of building engineering meeting log for a particular day in that future, where all of the different people that company would have to engage with, the homeowners, the facilities engineers, the local education docent, the local like healthcare official, everybody they were going to have to learn to interact with was kind of represented in that story. And the idea of it was it made them start thinking about, we're not just engineering for buying TV programs and piping them in at 4K. We're going to have to start thinking about how the responsibility of delivering health, education, wellness, climate control, environmental protection, all of these things into people's homes. That's going to stretch our responsibilities much wider in the future than we have today. So that's going to mean hiring new people, lobbying for new regulation, you know, thinking about our acquisitions differently. Do we next acquire a real estate company instead of an entertainment company? Do we buy a hospital chain or a wellness, you know, a gym? All of the questions they're starting to actually deal with right now, we were talking to them about 2 or 3 years ago. So in this case, we were presenting them with these stories and allowing the engineers to engage with them and the business managers to think about how they might strategize differently for that future. It was meant to be kind of a textual, visual engagement for them.
And I'll insert here that one of the things that is sometimes surprising to our clients is that we intentionally don't only provide positive, you're going to survive and everything's going to be great and you'll keep making money kinds of scenarios. We have to touch on, there will be positives and negatives in all of these, but they are going to give you opportunities to consider what would we do in this particular situation, or how would we address or handle that?
And the particular request here was, I've got a team of brilliant engineers who are stuck in the kind of day-to-day, step-by-step development, and we need to pull them back out of that and let them see much bigger possibility in the world. As Susan said, things that are really amazing and things that might be really, really challenging. And at the end of that exercise, interestingly, the engineers loved the more challenging stuff because it gave them constraints and discontinuities and kind of left turns that they don't deal with day to day. And they started, just kind of erupting with new ideas of things to do, whereas just keeping them comfortable wasn't challenging them enough. In that vein, so this is actually stepping forward to something more material and physical, working with the Red Cross to do something similar, to take policymakers who are setting the strategy for the International Red Cross globally over the next 5 to 10 years, and to shake them up a little bit and provoke them into thinking differently about the challenges they might face. They did a lot of trends research they delivered to us, and they said, can you produce some physical objects that that we could take and put in our kind of general, kind of global summit, our plenary with the most senior people in the Red Cross, that will pull them out of their, kind of policy discussions and put them face to face with possible realities in ways that can change the discussion, that can kind of shift the way they think about the world. Some of the issues that they were looking at were new technologies that they're going to be facing, new threats and things like climate change and conflict that would be driving migration around the world, things like blockchain and new identity and sort of legal technologies, but also new competitors. You don't think about the Red Cross as having a competitor, but if you think about the types of organizations that are responding to crises right now, it's international organizations, but also private organizations, private companies. So recently, for example, companies like Amazon have gotten into last mile delivery of vaccines. FedEx is trying to deal with this right now, and DHL and all of the kind of global logistics companies. They're not just dealing with delivering groceries and books, but they may be dealing with delivering food,
PPE.
Clothing, PPE. I mean, look at all of the supply chain breakdowns in COVID. So this was actually a sort of provocation of a portable identity kit that could be used to meet emergency migrants, people who were sort of fleeing climate change or conflict in the field where they were originating and not at the end, deliver them not just new identity or temporary identity documents so they could be more easily served, but also to deliver them temporary digital passports from countries around the world that were donating legal protection electronically. Have any of you heard of the e-Estonia kind of digital citizenship program? So right now, the country of Estonia is allowing people to become e-residents. You're not allowed to physically go there necessarily with that residency, but it provides you the legal access to Estonia as a country digitally. You can visit, but it's not a residency visa, but it would allow you or I to start a business there, sign documents, open bank accounts. So they basically open a little hole in the kind of, firewall of the country and let you reach in. It also means they can provide some protections internationally as well. So right now you can go to a corner shop and get a temporary SIM for, a phone for 90 days. Why can't you get temporary healthcare, education, or human rights protection from a third country just as easily? That was meant to sort of get these international leaders to start thinking differently about the way they approach challenges that they deal with. So this object was made, delivered to them. They were able to kind of interact with it, ask questions about it, look into the background research that kind of brought us to that idea. They actually asked for it to be taken to Geneva, to the UN Human Rights Council, to Denmark, the Red Cross, to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to a humanitarian summit.
To Egypt.
To Egypt, I think, as well. So it became a kind of conversation starter or a provocation that was moving around the world to help jumpstart consideration of different futures of migration and identity.
How are we on time?
We're getting very close, right?
Yeah, so what I thought is like, now you're talking about so,
Yeah.
Before and getting some of the work later.
Yep.
So I would say that we can have you 6 cycles, sorry. Or, well,
40.
max would be 4.
Okay. We're reasonably close to the end. We have a couple more we can do.
Yeah. So then they have a few minutes to
Yeah.
stretch their arms, their legs, go outside, get them some fresh air, then we will go upstairs.
So this project was, again, sort of different. You can, we're showing a few space projects because they tend to be fun. But this was actually bringing together a number of scientists and technologists around the UK to think about the future of science and tech for the Royal Society in London. And they're, again, kind of experts at what they do on a day-to-day basis, but we wanted to get them thinking a little more kind of sideways about what the future might look like, how their programs are funded, who's engaged with them. And in this case, we were working around the future of space in the UK and whether there would be private or public programs developing kind of space travel. And we started kind of dealing with this question of, well, how would you fund it if it was funded like the way the lottery works in some countries, where if you buy a scratch card and play the lottery, some of that money goes to education or to health or to public services or the arts. What if we use that same idea to fund asteroid mining, space exploration, which of course seems ridiculous, but we kind of put this out there as a way for them to engage with very different futures. And so working together with a group called Smithery in the UK, we came up with this idea of these asteroid mining scratch cards where you pay £10 at the corner shop, you buy them, you scratch and see if you've won like 1/1,000,000th of an asteroid, because the platinum or titanium on that asteroid might be worth, $1 trillion. So your £10 bet might bring you, $1 million back, but also it would be one way of funding space exploration. Sounds ridiculous, but it actually kind of started the program. It started them discussing like, okay, what is the basis of funding public science? And, should we be doing it this way? Should we be funding it directly from the government? How do we engage the public? And also those sorts of kind of questions. So this was a bit more fun. We actually did time capsules from the future that contained these objects, but some of these things are big and complex, and some of them are small and humorous. The next project that we worked on last year was in the UK, basically looking at how could community organizations and emergency authorities interact differently in the future. This came after the Grenfell fire, which some of you may remember. I guess it was about 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago in the UK, where a major housing complex in central London burned, and many people died in the process of trying to rescue people. There was kind of a breakdown in both the way the community was able to deal with that emergency and the fire and rescue and health and government authorities. So we wanted to look at different might emerge in the future in the UK and different ways that community groups might step forward and kind of self-manage, given the government is stretched to the limits. So we created 5 different scenarios with 5 different crises, from blackouts to energy failures to flooding to fires to a public health crisis. And in this particular case, we were able to kind of create a scenario and imagine what would happen if you had a kind of guerrilla public health group created by the community, by volunteers that were working outside official channels to manage public health. Now that sounds like where we are right now, but this was again 18 to 24 months ago. But we were helping them explore how they would engage with, how would the government actually deal with the emergence of totally independent private volunteer organizations that were bringing public health information to people in their homes, particularly in immigrant communities where they might not let official health, public health groups in. And it helped them understand where the gap was between where their capabilities and policies were today and where these future groups might emerge and how they would actually communicate with them before they got there. So in this case, it was we developed all of the leaflets and handouts and materials and the backpacks and banners and sort of all of the things that would exist for that organization, presented them to these authorities without telling them that they were fictional future groups. And they actually were interacting with them, at least briefly, in a way that they thought they were existing in the world today. And it kind of created a simulation space for those government authorities to figure out where the mismatches were in dealing with those kind of emergent public health groups. Kind of similar to the Red Cross Project, in the sense of sort of like, here's a new player in the world. How do you change your approach to deal with cooperating, collaborating, supplying those groups? So the last one is kind of the biggest scale of all, but for about 3 or 4 years, we actually worked with a combination of the Dubai Future Foundation and a group called Telart in Amsterdam, who are brilliant designers, coders, engineers, creators of immersive spaces, to create a kind of museum of the future where you could explore different futures and kind of step into them in an immersive sense and understand better how you might live in those worlds, both from a kind of government perspective and from a citizen perspective. And right now, there's actually a permanent museum of the future being built in Dubai that will house new immersions and new exhibits that help us think about space and biology and food systems that came from kind of development of this, but the same process that we used for some of those other projects were then taken to concept level, and then the designers could build kind of full environments for us to step into those futures more immersive sense, to begin to ask questions about how we would live in or not live in those futures.
What kind of technology is that?
So this is actually on screen. This was the conversion of car parks and sort of interior spaces like warehouses into vertical farms and hydroponics. So as the temperature gets hotter, the soil becomes more arid, the saline content of the soil increases, which is all happening now. How would you actually feed a population of 10 million or 15 million in that country using rapid fabrication of internal sort of interior farming spaces? So things that are actually probably quite familiar to you and to IAAC in the space, but put in extreme environments so that you can grow an entirely new agricultural sector. In this case, they were looking at things like banyan forests for water purification, kind of rapid fabrication units that can be moved around in the desert to build structures, vertical farming, vertical sort of our interior development of like rapid pharmaceutical and drug production, all of the sort of stuff that you kind of explore in a more advanced sense here. But how do you kind of think about that in the context of an entire society or region of the world in the Gulf? And how can that kind of provoke policymakers to think about what needs to happen now in 2020 to more easily enable that transition from traditional agriculture, traditional, desalination, those types of processes?
Well, and particularly in Dubai, also importing most of your food. So can you convert your economy to grow your own agriculture?
Sorry? I mean, it's interesting because this was actually 2017, I think, when we started working on this. Sorry, we were asking, the question was, Hong Kong, yes. So Hong Kong is starting to work on things like vertical farming, sorry. No, it's Mask plus Zoom plus. Singapore, other countries are working with it. Dubai is actually accelerated it. The Netherlands is developing it.
I was going to say that the name of the company, I know them personally. Rooftop Republic. They're doing like on rooftops.
Right.
Farms and all.
So there's a
Rooftop Republic?
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Rooftop Republic is one of the organizations. Actually, a tremendous amount of funding has flowed into this. But the interesting thing in terms of, we think about the future and cause and effect, there is a relationship, albeit kind of broad, between experiences like this being kind of developed and presented to, in that case, both the government and sort of citizen groups 3 years ago, and now there being a Minister of Food Security who is actively funding and exploring and commissioning accelerated development of vertical farming and interior farming, because COVID has shown that heavy food importation and loss of those logistics supply chains suddenly cuts off, a substantial amount of the food supply for the country in a very short period of time. So these are all kind of issues of resilience running through so many of these topics that are focusing on, food risk, safety, migration, climate, and protection of vulnerable populations. So when I said at the beginning, we kind of moved away from consumer products and traditional innovation towards these other issues, this is a lot of where Futures is kind of getting reoriented today to dealing with, what a designer might call wicked problems or, transition challenges is kind of where our work is faced. And so everything from these digital educational kind of experiences through to, kind of print and workshop experiences to physical objects to, fully immersive experiences. We've done audio, video, like every tool we can kind of engage to kind of use this similar arc of activity to push people to think about what they need to change and how quickly.
And I should probably say really quickly that one thing that is not always abundantly clear to our clients or our students when we teach is that we are not aiming for solutions. We are offering provocations or interesting, aspects of possible futures to consider to help guide whoever does develop solutions. So we come first, but as designers or future designers, what we want to share is that there's work that you can do to help understand what your solutions might need to aim towards. But in our work, we never present something and say, it's going to look like that. And it's going to work perfectly, because we don't know that.
This orange box is, well, first it's non-functioning, but we could get it to work if we spend a little bit more money on it. It's a kind of working biometric box. It has a thermal printer inside. It's all pieces that we could, purchase today on the market. But the object wasn't to kind of get the Red Cross to go spend money to make
we need 500
field biometric units. It was to actually get them thinking about how they would deal with identity protection, migration, and some of the sort of technical legal issues, especially when they were going to start encountering other entrants who have the same objective. So, hopefully they won't, they might make something like this, I don't know, but it wasn't meant to sort of be a demo. It's a provocation in a box, if you will.
What are your thoughts on moving towards global citizenship?
So what are our thoughts on moving towards global citizenship? It's interesting. We're actually both Estonian e-citizens on Dutch visas with US passports. So I guess we're halfway there. This is actually a live question that we know people who are working on right now about how do we change some of these boundaries? This is the reason we were doing these sorts of things 2 or 3 years ago, because we could see this question coming of how do we deal with sort of shifting the kind of ways that law works and the technology works, because to kind of enable us to get out of these national boxes that we're in part because of the need to either find safety or find education or find economic livelihoods or be with each other, you know, across borders, all of these sorts of things. And they're actual live questions that we're dealing with in the background on very kind of softly defined projects right now. We've actually been asked to kind of prototype a kind of kit that would explore the idea of sort of subscription bundles for different services and citizenships around the world, in the same way that right now you can subscribe to, you know, your cable provider also gives you Netflix and probably something else, and, you know, Nickelodeon. Like, why can't you do that with insurance, healthcare? Probably everyone in this room and everyone online has been playing this game of being in different parts of the world and kind of crossing borders. Those are questions we've been exploring for at least a decade now. And now we're actually up against the prototyping phase, or the hard kind of commercial and economic questions. And at least having explored them for a decade, we've got some thoughts about that. But
I was going to say, I think the global citizenship question is one where we would talk about an unevenly distributed future, because it's definitely a privilege to be able to, you know, move to the Netherlands or, you know, travel to Spain or, you know, do all of those things. So this provocation, this box, was a way of asking the question, can you give that privilege to people who generally would never, ever, ever have access to it? So one of the aspects of, you see the little blue bracelet down at the bottom, that was also sort of a digital bank account so that people could, you know, or carry all of their identity elements with them, because one of the things about being, you know, a refugee is, do you have all your birth certificates? Do you have your marriage certificate? Do you have your, you know, doctoral thesis and your, you know, your PhD documentation that will allow you to get a job somewhere else if you are transported to a third country? So, you know, this was a way of exploring all of those questions in one little box. So we'd like to think about small things that can provoke a lot of questions.
yeah.
And I think that even in design work, it's kind of, it will make you a better designer if you can think about the ways in which, you know, those provocations might improve your sense of what your solution might be to a question that you have or a project that you're working on.
And these are not the kinds of things you want to have to be solved suddenly, because we've seen this from COVID, right? You know, governments, private organizations, citizens groups, all trying to solve these existential problems now. And some of them are working, but most of the approaches aren't. But backing up and having the opportunity to sort of explore these issues before they emerge, it gives us time. Because, for example, the thing that Susan showed, the little blue bracelet, one of the immediate questions there is, what are the downsides to having your digital identity centralized with different organizations that have political sensitivities and also are able to be manipulated by certain governments? It's not necessarily a great thing. But, you know, there are people out there right now trying to put blockchain identity, you know, blockchain identity for refugees and migrants. There are a lot of pros and cons to that question, but you want to be looking at those before you collide with the actual problem. So, I mean, these are some different examples of the types of things we work on. It may not have been what you expected, but you know, it's basically where our work is going these days, and moving into sort of different forms of experience and different kind of modes of design, so that we can continue to provoke and ask questions that are critical to solve, critical to kind of deal with in novel ways that kind of break through the noise and pull people into different spaces for thinking.
Okay, so I think that I have.
Thank you for your patience.
We are almost out of time. Can we do like one or two questions?
Sure.
That's on you, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that you like the presentation and you've seen not just the motivation and the approach, but also some examples of what they've been working on. So like the full process. And that was like helping to think about what it means, what is a specific introduction to what it means in the future. I think we have some questions, so we have one from the audience.
I have one from the online audience. So the question is around your own teachings and your own speculations and working. So the question is basically, how do you gather data and you use this to actually form your speculations? So how much of your own experiences come into the process when you work?
So how much of our own experiences come into the process? That's a question that we actually pay really close attention to, because we try not to necessarily impose our own values on the different sort of questions that we're dealing with, and are very careful to sort of scope those sort of issues out early on, in the sense that we don't want to kind of create a process that forces an answer or that forces a particular point of view. We try to kind of put the tools in the hands of the people we're working with, open their eyes to a lot of different possibilities and kind of lenses and points of view, and give them the autonomy and the agency to move in the direction that they want to move in. Now, that doesn't mean that we keep our values wholly outside of it, but we try not to sort of say, you know, oh, you have to pick this future. Life experiences and kind of lived experience is a slightly different issue, I think. And one of the reasons we don't all look like me in the group is because we need different lived experiences that can kind of be brought to the table from the professionals in the team. You know, Susan can bring very, very different points of view and different lived experiences to describing certain futures or understanding critical issues, or Lily or Madeline or any of the sort of folks who we work with on a day-to-day basis, not just in terms of gender, socioeconomics, you know, sort of power balances, access, all of these sorts of issues kind of come into play.
I always like to say that we are futures agnostic. You know, Elon Musk has a future that he wants you to buy. We don't sell futures. So we really try to do a good job of stepping back and presenting, you know, a sufficient number of scenarios to make it a useful exercise to consider possible futures.
Cool. Do we have any questions from the audience here? Yes.
So I can tell you clusters or these assessments into cultural, economic, but how do you go into clustering mathematical time? I saw that horizon 1, horizon 2. Is that a specific time frame, and then do they have a special category niche?
So that's a really important kind of question that gets glossed over here. We were so the question was around how do we deal with time? So I've talked earlier about how different time horizons, different kind of timelines are useful for different industries or different types of questions, whether it's, you know, consumer product versus kind of geology. Those have very different time horizons. So one of the things we try to understand at the very beginning is what are the kind of operative time horizons that are important, not just to the group we're working with. Do they have certain rulemaking or product production or innovation cycles or financial cycles that are their kind of rhythms or beats that they work by? But also, what are the relevant cycles or time horizons for all of the sort of issues that are involved here? And then how do we balance those two things out? Doing a 100-year exploration for toothpaste is probably not the best alignment of product cycle to time horizon, but doing a 100-year exploration for infrastructure, water systems might be, because you want to be planning on very long time frames for engineering, climate, geology, all those sorts of things. So we ask those clear scoping questions up front. We actually talk about this quite a lot in the book because it tends to get disappeared. You jump straight into trying to solve the problem.
As quickly as
possible. Getting a sense of what the most intelligent time horizons are, and then using those horizon labels like horizon 1, 2, 3 to kind of help break those down is where we sort of use those kind of placeholder tags.
Cool. So if there's no, okay, that's not.
Thank you for bearing with us for so long. It's not an easy.
So my question is partially related to time travel. So when you project futures, do you also count with the possible alternate fact that you project in the future for the organization and how basically the future is?
So when we're doing this work, do we take into consideration that we may be altering the future? So it's an interesting question. It is a physics question. we'll leave that aside for a minute. But so Heisenberg can deal with that part of it. We are in some ways impacting choice and directionality by the information that we share and disclose in the conversations we have, and we're actually quite conscious of that. And we often don't get to see the end product of our work because it might be a decision that's not made or a choice that's not taken or a path that isn't followed, or it might be fragmented into 5 different products in 5 years. You never see it. But back to the kind of values question, we're actually quite conscious of what we're introducing and where those issues are headed, and realizing that some very small conversations in 2020 can actually lead to some very substantial change in 2040. Who we work with, where they are in their careers or their practice, can potentially be quite magnified down the road. We can't ever really think concretely about that now, but we're also quite aware of it, which is like the best audiences we've worked with are 14, 15, 16-year-olds who were headed to a very prestigious university because we thought about those kids that we're talking to today about the future are potentially going to be CEOs, legislators,
VCs,
venture capitalists who are funding things. So the ethics conversations and the choice conversations we're having with them at 15 years old could be quite substantial down the road. So sometimes it's more interesting to work with little time machines at 15 years old than it is to try to unwire time with a 60-year-old.
Yeah, that's why education now is so important.
Yes. That might be an interesting place to leave it.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you everybody online for being patient and staying with us, and thank you for inviting us.
Cool. So I can back to the So I hope that you like the setup. We are providing, as you can see, I hope that also people will be online, they could say hi. They also like it. I think that it's almost fine. I'll give you some time if you want to talk with Scott and Suzanne. And around 5-ish, we should go upstairs for the workshop. It's going to be fun because actually it's about protecting your future profession. So I think it fits really well with what we've been talking today. Again, this is an exercise of speculation, which we'll see what other ways we can implement the program to work on. And yes, I don't want to make it longer. So just relax a bit, and then we need to go to which floor? Okay, 3rd floor. We need to go to the 3rd floor. I guess that Kiara or someone will be there to go. Just relax a bit and get outside, go to the fresh air. Talk with them if you like, and I'll see you upstairs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.